from the News Channel 5 network. This is Open Line.
Hi, everyone. Rory Johnston with you here on Open Line on News Channel 5 Plus. It is a Thursday night. We welcome you. We open up the phone lines, and tonight we're diving into another, I'll call it a heavy topic, but definitely an important one. And we are talking about critical race theory. And you see the question there, should critical race theory be taught in Tennessee schools? Before we even get to that question, I am literally have been reading today about it, learning a lot more, and our guest tonight is going to help explain it and talk about this subject as well. His name is Tim Wise. He is among the most prominent anti-racist writers and educators in the U.S., 26 years speaking to audiences all over the place in professional and academic conferences. Based here in Nashville, was an advisor to the Fisk University Race Relations Institute. I could go on and on, but we're thrilled that you're joining us, Tim. Thanks for being with us and spending an hour with us.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So we have heard this buzzword, this phrase, quite a bit recently in the news, especially if you're watching the networks, the national networks, whether it be a conservative network or a liberal or right in the middle. They're talking a lot about it. So let's break this down before we hopefully get some calls. How do we define critical race theory? What is that?
Well, I'm glad you started with that, because the people who have made such an issue of this thing called critical race theory, and the people in the Tennessee legislature who have seen fit to quote unquote ban it, clearly have never answered or even asked that question, let alone really come to the answers. They've caricatured it and misrepresented what it is. So critical race theory is basically a theoretical school of thought that developed within the legal discipline, within the law, among law professors, to sort of analyze the questions about why, in spite of the progress of the civil rights movement, why, in spite of the formal legal victories of the 1960s, why, in spite of formal equal opportunity, as a result of those victories, there was still such profound inequality in the labor market, in housing, in schools, in the justice system, et cetera. And they were asking that question. That's the same question, by the way, that conservatives want to know and that regular, mainstream liberals want to know. They just answer the question differently. Critical race theory fundamentally says that the reason we still have such profound racial disparity in this country, white families with 12 times the net worth of black families on average, for instance, is that racism and racial inequality has been so embedded in the structure of the society from the beginning that formal equal opportunity is not enough to create real equity or equal protection of the law. Now, one is free to disagree with that argument, and there's lots of great discussions that people can have about it, but that is literally the primary sort of building block of critical race theory, is the notion that inequality in this country is not an accident, and it's not just the result of, we haven't quite been able to figure out how to fix it. Critical race theory says inequality was the point from the beginning, that we were actually a nation founded with liberty and justice for some, not for all. And both the history and the sociology and the legal analysis justify that argument. That is what critical race theory really is. Right. Not a lot of the stuff that the lawmakers say, which is, it thinks white people are inherently racist or bigoted. That's not part of critical race theory, or that certain groups are inferior or superior morally to others based on race. That's not part of critical race theory. It is literally just a way of looking at inequality and trying to answer, why do we still have so much of it?
I remember when I was in college, in high school and college back in the 80s, talking about, we learned about the civil rights movement in the 60s, and we had discussions about race, especially when I went to college, which was much more diverse. I remember sitting on my dorm floor with people of color and just having, sharing a six-pack of beer. And I'm inquisitive by nature. That's why I do what I do. I love to ask questions. And I was just fascinated by people's stories. How did you grow up, and where did, and why do you think that way? I remember back then thinking, in my mind, well, things are going to be okay pretty soon. And here we are almost 40 years later. What is it about the last few years where it seems like there really is a push now? There's a social push. Obviously, there's been a lot in the news, the former president and some of the police shootings, but it really does seem like now is the time that people, are having these discussions that sometimes are uncomfortable.
Right. Well, I think there's a few things. I mean, certainly, the 24-hour news cycle brings to our attention issues of racial injustice or racial disparity. We see the, incidents involving police because people have cell phones, so we're able to see things that frankly were going on, obviously, long before the invention of cell phones. We have social media that can spread information much more rapidly. So I think that has a lot to do with why the intensification has happened. But it's also because, look, the reality is that we're living in a country, like it or not, and I know there are people who don't like it, but I don't much care, and there's nothing that they can do about it. We're living in a country that is becoming increasingly diverse. And if you go from a country where those of us who were white were able to take for granted our dominance, our numerical dominance, our power dominance, that we were like the floor model of what an American means. And now we have to share that designation, and we have to share it with people who look different and pray different and have different cultural traditions. And there are some people in this country, and especially within the white community, not all, but certainly some, who are very uncomfortable with that change. And I would suggest that when they say, for instance, that they wish to take their country back or make America great again, it's because they have this sort of fictional, nostalgic version of America the way they remember it, which wasn't great for a lot of people, wasn't great for Black folks, wasn't great for Muslims, wasn't great for women as women who couldn't even get their own credit line in many cases until the early 70s when the Equal Credit Opportunity Act passed. Wasn't great for LGBTQ folks. So I think there are some people who, as the country changes, become increasingly anxious about really sort of losing not opportunity, not even power, but sort of hegemonic dominance of the country. And so I think that's another thing that's happening. The anxiety level has gotten ramped up because the country is changing in ways that the dominant group sometimes finds it hard to accept. Whereas 30 years ago, that level of backlash maybe wouldn't have been quite as strong.
When you think about when people, just like you brought up, when people say, some people who are opposed to what they call critical race theory say that people want to change history and that they don't believe that the United States is as great a country as they think it is, and they're unpatriotic and whatnot. How do you answer that? I mean, I love this country. I do think it's just a phenomenal experiment that we've come so far, but we still have a ways to go. And I've tried to explain to people, I think that we're constantly changing and progressing and growing, like you said, and it's just an inevitable fact that this is going to happen. So what, where do we draw that line where maybe some people do feel attacked, feel like their history in the country? How do we have that discussion?
Well, look, of course it's a great country. It's the country that gave us Martin Luther King Jr. and Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and the geniuses of the civil rights struggle. The country is filled with amazing people. But that doesn't change the fact that the country was founded not on the basis of equality for everybody. I mean, when Thomas Jefferson wrote those lovely words that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he owned about 230 human beings at the time that he wrote those words. So he didn't actually believe them. The very first law that the Congress passed after the Constitution was ratified was a thing called the Naturalization Act of 1790. It was the first thing they did. And what that law said was that all free white persons and only free white persons could be citizens of the United States. So what that means is before they raised taxes, before they figured out the army, before before they did anything, they were like, you know what, we need to make sure that we're clear only white people can really be Americans. So when critical race theorists and those of us in that tradition say America was founded in part on the basis of oppression, we're not just saying it to be hyperbolic or mean-spirited, let alone unpatriotic. We're saying that's part of who we are. Now, it's not all of who we are.
Right.
We are also the abolitionists, right? We are also the civil rights movement. We are also the people who fight for justice. The real problem with the way we teach history is not what the critical race theorists are doing. It's what was done. I remember as a child, and I'm not sure exactly how old you are. I'm 52. When I was a kid, this is actually the first book that I ever read. I don't know why I still have it. I think it's my mom never throws anything away. It's a book about Andrew Jackson, and it was written for children, and I read it in 1971. It's like the first book I ever read. If you read that book, which is how we used to teach history, you would think that Andrew Jackson, you know, his ownership of slaves in this book is talked about, well, you know, that's just how everybody thought in the South. They thought it was okay. Well, that's not true, actually. There were Southerners who didn't believe in the system of enslavement. First off, the black slaves didn't believe in it, and a lot of other white folks didn't either. But they make it so normal that you're, as a child, you're reading that and thinking, oh, and at the end it says, you know, when Jackson died, his slaves stood at his bed and cried for him. That's not true. There's no historian that actually said that. Just like George Washington didn't really chop down a cherry tree and tell his father because he was so honest. But that's the kind of history we spoon feed children because we want them to have this uncritical narrative, but that's not honest. And if we want to confront our history and do better, we have to look at the entirety, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we don't like to look at the ugly, which means we can't really appreciate the good.
We're going to dive into a little more about that, why we don't want to talk about the ugly stuff. When we come back, calls are pouring in. We got to take our first break. Stay right there, everybody. We'll be right back.